Thank you, Heather. Round of applause for Heather. This is just an amazing. And also, I don't know if they're in earshot, but for people that have served the food today and are invisibly moving around, making things clean and work and functional, to everyone who's doing stuff behind the scenes, if we could just give a really loud cheer so they can hear how much we appreciate what they've been doing. My name's Ben Wikler. I'm the Washington director of MoveOn.org, the activist group that might send you much too much email. Thank you. How can I avoid this? All right. My left? Perfect. Okay. And I'm also the host of a podcast and radio show called The Good Fight. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is something that all of us do. It's something that's been discussed here before. It's storytelling. And what I'm going to offer is some reflections on how to tell a story that people will want to hear. Because it's not just the stories that we tell, it's how we tell them that affects how much they affect other people. And I've had the privilege of interviewing several hundred of the people that I admire most in the world. And discovering that, first of all, there are heroes all over the place. And secondly, many of them are terrible storytellers. But they all could be amazing storytellers. And I think all of us here want to change the world in one way or another. So if I can offer anything that's helpful to you, I would be thrilled. But I'd like to start by sharing a story that profoundly changed me. It was the summer after my freshman year of college. Excuse me, summer after my sophomore year of college. And I had just met my then girlfriend, who I had met at a meeting to organize a rally to push the United States Congress to increase funding to fight AIDS in Africa, which is a great place to, pick up people. And Beth and I had met at this meeting, and we'd organized this rally, and a bunch of people had come out for it. And I had gotten involved in this fight against the global AIDS crisis, kind of based on math and reading articles about this was bad, and the United States wasn't doing much about it, and maybe we could do something about it. And I felt like a strong moral fervor that this was really important. So I had gotten involved in activism. I helped start something called the Student Global AIDS Campaign, but it was completely abstract for me. And then I was lucky enough to get a little grant to go to South Africa and try to meet some people, and I had no idea what I was doing. So I just emailed everyone I knew and asked them who they knew in South Africa, in Cape Town, who I should talk to about this. And someone emailed me that I should meet this guy named Zaki Ahmad. And the name was unfamiliar, and I landed and I took a bus out to meet this guy. And he was this tall, normal height of people, very gentle, immediately offered me tea and invited me to sit down on a beautiful couch, and then told me about the plan for today, for that day, which was to go to Khayelitsha, which is a township outside of Cape Town, for an event, a protest, where they were unveiling a campaign to push the government of South Africa to treat women who were giving birth to prevent the mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And I wound up staying with Zaki for the next week and discovering that he's one of the most inspiring and extraordinary people on planet Earth. Because Zaki, when he was, I forget how old he was, in 1998, I think he was around my age now, he was in South Africa and he discovered that he had HIV. And at that time, the government of South Africa denied that HIV caused AIDS. And even if they acknowledged it, basically, there was no government in the developed world that was offering treatment for HIV/AIDS. The idea was absurd. Experts said that wasn't even possible to do in resource-poor settings. The drugs themselves cost tens of thousands of dollars a year. A few years after that, the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development said people in Africa couldn't take AIDS medicine. They don't even have watches. And Zaki was privileged enough that he could have afforded to get the medicine for himself. But he made a decision. And he announced publicly that he wasn't going to take AIDS medicine until AIDS medicines were available to everyone through the public sector in South Africa. And for the next several years, as he got sicker and sicker, he helped create and launch the Treatment Action Campaign, which was based in the townships like Khayelitsha, and became a nationwide movement that challenged the conscience of his country and of the entire world. Zaki would do things like travel to India and then come back loaded with generically produced AIDS medicine and get arrested as he got off the plane in front of TV cameras. He was working with people who were dying every day, and they took a page from American AIDS activists and had political funerals. They did extraordinary things, and eventually they started getting the government's attention, and then every drug company in the world got together, not the generic ones, all the other ones got together and sued the South African government to stop them from ever using generic drugs. And they built a 250,000 person global petition, and they faced down the drug companies and gave them such bad PR that they dropped the lawsuit. And I learned about that day when we got to Khayelitsha and went to the office. I took a picture in front of this banner that they'd made that said 250,000 say drop the lawsuit. I was floored. And in the course of that week, my whole thinking about what I was trying to do completely changed from being like, me and the other students' great idea to being fundamentally about solidarity for the people doing the real work, taking risks far beyond anything we could comprehend, our heroes. And I realized that their stories were far more powerful than the statistics that I was quoting. I got back to the US and I started talking to other students about what I'd seen and what I'd seen Zaki do, what I'd seen in Khayelitsha. And other students, the Treatment Action Campaign started a fellowship program for American college students to come over and just learn from them. And the movement spread in the United States like wildfire. We had students on hundreds of campuses across the United States, students from every congressional district pushing on Congress, and we played a role along with activists all over the world, a lot of people from the AIDS movement that transformed the United States health policy originally, that changed US policy from $100 million a year to fight global AIDS in 2001 when we started. We played some role in moving it to $2.5 billion announced in 2003, which was a number that we had almost not been ready to call for. That's how much experts thought was needed, but it seemed absurdly high. But finally we decided that was our goal, and we called for it, and then it actually happened. President Bush announced that he was going to give $2.5 billion a year in the same speech as he announced the Iraq War. And the history of how that funding transformation happened tends to be about Bush talking to some conservative Christian leaders and Anthony Fauci, who's the health officials in the United States. But we know from the meetings that we had with congressional officials and officials of the administration, and we know from the pushback and response we got from people in power about how insane these numbers were and we should be realistic. And then we know from the bad press that they got and then how they changed their mind. We know that actually a movement was involved in changing that. A movement helped change the policy in the US the same way that movements, the Treatment Action Campaign and the AIDS movement, transformed the policies in South Africa, and working with people fighting these fights in global health all around the world just transformed the way HIV and AIDS are treated and now prevented. We had the experience of being a little part of something really big that changed the world. And my experience coming out of that was basically that I just could not stop doing that. That was the most amazing thing I could imagine being part of. And so in the years since, I've been lucky enough to work in activism professionally in a whole bunch of different settings and meet people who are changing the world in this vast scale. But throughout, I've had this funny feeling that I had all these incredible secrets because almost nobody that I've met in the United States has ever heard of Zaki Ahmad. This is someone whose story everyone should know. Kids should learn about his story in school. This should be just part of how we understand the world. And there are a lot of other people like him who are doing amazing things. There are people here with us today who are doing these kinds of things. But instead, when you look around, what you see is stories of people making huge amounts of money, people who are really good at sports, people who are good at being in movies. We basically lift up a set of heroes that aren't actually the heroes that all of us would like to emulate or to be challenged to emulate. And I think that has a corrosive effect on us. But all of us have the power to change that by telling stories about people who are actually fighting for things that change the world. So what I'd like to suggest is a couple of tips about how to do that. in a way that can actually have an impact. Because it's very hard, I think, especially when you've done something, but also even when you're talking about what someone else has done, to remember that something that's amazing and important needs to actually be a story for it to make emotional sense. So here are my 3 tips about how to tell a story about changing the world that people will clamor to hear. And I need to work on that headline. The first thing is, if it's on the internet, obsess over the headline. This is no joke. So has anyone here ever shared something on Upworthy.com? Everyone here, I'm going to guess, has experienced an Upworthy headline. Has anyone here read or clicked on something from The Onion on the internet? Okay, great. So when I was in high school, I got to write Onion headlines. I got to try my hand at being an Onion writer, and I did that throughout college for a bunch of years, and occasionally still send them ideas. And the thing about The Onion and about Upworthy and about most of the sort of things that regularly churn out stuff that goes viral on the internet is that they're obsessive about headlines. And the way that you write good headlines is by writing bad headlines. A lot of bad headlines. So the basic idea is this: if you have something that you want other people to read or click on, write 25 different headlines for that thing. Most of them will be horrible, literally 25. Get out a numbered list piece of paper or use Word or something and just push them out. And you'll be embarrassed by most of them. But what'll happen is that the first like 10 or 15 will be just literal summaries of the thing you're writing about, and then eventually you'll run out of ways to rephrase that, and you'll find that you're actually describing the thing that makes it interesting to you, or makes it strike a chord in you, or makes you curious about it. And somewhere in headline sort of 18 to 25, you'll find something that if you didn't know the story already, you would want to click on that, and that's the one you want to use. And if you don't know which one that is, then ask a bunch of your friends, and they'll tell you. 25 headlines. Trust me, it really works. The second thing to make a story that will be compelling to people is to locate the moment of decision that defined who you became. So this is actually a technique in storytelling that is at the heart of a lot of organizing and activism strategies. And I learned it in the AIDS campaign when I was in college. I was just starting this campaign to try to get people to write to Congress about AIDS funding, and didn't really know how to do it aside from lecturing people. And I talked to this guy named Tim Atwater, who was a priest from a small town in Vermont, but who at that point was the head of Jubilee USA, which was this extraordinary movement that was working with the Pope and people all around the world to push their governments to cancel the debt of countries that had racked up huge amounts of debt because of the borrowing of leaders that didn't represent their people, borrowing money from governments that wanted to influence those leaders as opposed to helping the development and the people of those countries. So this is illegitimate debt, and they'd had extraordinary successes, and I was totally dazzled by this. And what he said to me, actually, he didn't say to me. The beginning of our phone conversation, when I told him what I wanted to do, is he asked me where I was born. And he started asking me about my life. And then he just started telling me about his life. And I like discovered all these ways, the things we had in common. And I started really trusting him and being curious about him. And then once he'd gone through all that, he said, now Ben, what I just did was called a story of self, and it's what you need to do in one-to-one conversations with everyone who you think might be an important part of what you're doing. And it was a totally mesmerizing lesson. And it's actually the core of how the Obama campaign in 2008 organized house by house and block by block in the early primary states and won the primary and won the general election. Storytelling, one-to-one storytelling, one-to-group storytelling that uses this basic idea has already been just a massive history-shaping force. And when you're telling your story of self, you want to give some sort of structural details. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, a place I recommend to everyone. But then you want to look for a moment that kind of changed you, that challenged what your values or beliefs were, and a decision that you had to make about what you were going to do next that kind of revealed who you were going to become. A pivot point, a switch point, if you will. Find that moment and bring people into that moment, how it felt, what you were looking at the time. Try to bring them exactly into where you were. Because, and this is my third thing, vivid, concrete, physical details. Those are the only things that stick with people. I work in radio, and there's this old saying, radio has the best pictures. Because in radio, what we try to do is tell people exactly where and when we were. We were standing in front of this banner in this office in the township in Kailija. I should give you more details. It was, I think it had a tin roof, the building that I was in. And this room, I think there was no furniture. I think there were 2 folding chairs in the room, but there was this big banner hung on the wall. And there was sunlight streaming in, and there was tons of noise outside. And when I looked at that banner, I just had this tingling sensation on the back of my neck, because I couldn't do what Zachy was doing. I didn't have HIV. I couldn't refuse the medicine. I wouldn't have the courage to do it if I could. But I could ask people to sign petitions. That was something I could do. And that's what I do for a living now, right? So you want to find the physical, concrete details of those moments. Those are what stick with people. Those are what people can identify. And the weird thing is about extremely specific, particular moments, descriptions that are things that happen just to you, those are actually the most universal. Because our whole lives are composed of moments. And when you speak in generalities, there's no real identification there. There's all this research about how people process information. The first thing that researchers have discovered is that people actually process information through emotion. That people only remember stuff if they have an emotional reaction. And the second thing is that they process stories by inhabiting them themselves. That people actually have the same brain activity when they hear a story about something that they have when they experience that thing firsthand. Like you figuratively pull people right into your shoes when you tell someone a story that has those kinds of vivid details. So even if the thing that you're telling is a story about a fight that lasted a decade and involved thousands of people, just before you tell your story, find 1 moment, find 3 moments that you can describe in vivid, concrete, physical detail that pull someone in. And when you get to those moments, slow down and give people a chance to hear them. Because that takes me to my last thing. All of us face these character-defining choices, these character-defining moments. Understanding what your values are, why you do things, finding the moments that can illustrate that really matters, because the stories we tell define who we become. I met my girlfriend then in the AIDS campaign meeting, and she and I are now married. And she works on global health policy, actually. She works on US and international health policy in the US Senate and helps determine the budget for the National Institutes of Health. And I am on the outside getting petitions to try to influence people like her. We have interesting dinner table conversations. And we have a 3-year-old and an 8-week-old baby. And what we keep reminding each other about is that the biggest thing our kids will learn from us is the kinds of decisions that we make. It's not what we tell them. It's only kind of what we show them. It's actually the example we can give of the kind of life that we lead. That's the most fundamental unit, the example of character. And we influence our kids and we influence everyone around us. So I guess the last thing I want to urge you to do, everyone is here because they've made decisions to do something, not just for themselves, but for the world. So the last thing I want to do is ask you all to become storytellers, to find those stories and find ways and places to tell them, because often the things we're proudest of, there's so much vulnerability in describing them. It's really scary. It's scary to talk about risks that we took, uncertainty. It's scary to talk about values that we hold. But it's not preachy when you're describing what you went through. And so I'd like to ask you guys to give the gift of your story to other people, to the people in your family, the people around you, or to massive stages and millions of people. Giving the gift of telling your story, why you do what you do, why it matters, what it felt like when you made that decision, that can change the world. I know it's changed mine. Thank you.